بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. I'm so happy to be back. It was not something that I planned. قدر الله ما شاء فعل. So what happened was when I got to the airport, thank you, Dana, jazakallah khairah. When I got to the airport yesterday, the snow wasn't bad, but then by the time we got to the gate and the other plane was delayed and came in, the pilot of that incoming plane decided that he did not want to fly out, and I don't blame him, safety first, so alhamdulillah, that meant that I was able to come back and present this morning. So alhamdulillah, so happy to see all of you, and especially Sheikha Haifa. I've not seen Sheikha in several years. It's alhamdulillah, it's wonderful because the last time I saw Sheikha was before COVID, so time flies. So alhamdulillah, you've been able to benefit from Sheikha and are also, the other amazing scholars here. So what we agreed to do for this morning was, since I presented, several years, really years of history of Quranic preservation in 45 minutes, and we didn't really have a lot of time for Q&A, inshallah. What I'll do is I'll present an addendum to yesterday's discussion, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I'll make this addendum relatively brief so that we can come back to any questions you may have had. So again, as a quick refresher, yesterday, we discussed the preservation of the Quran under Sayyidina Abu Bakar radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And Sayyidina Abu Bakar is most famous for what accomplishment regarding the Quran? Who remembers? From the brother's side. Volunteer. Yes. Exactly. So Sayyidina Abu Bakar does Jam' al-Quran upon the advice of whom, my dear sisters? I need a volunteer. Yes, sister, the green hijab. Yes, Sayyidina Umar. So remember, Sayyidina Umar comes to Sayyidina Abu Bakr and advises him. At first, Sayyidina Abu Bakr is reluctant. But then, what is the context? What does Umar say? Brothers, what battle happens? The Battle of Yamama. And then, which young Sahabi sisters do they go to? Which young Sahabi do they go to supervise this process? Okay, yes. Zayd ibn Thabit, excellent. So what I want to do is I want to look at the idea of Quranic orthography, because I did not get into this yesterday at all. And just bear with me, because I will be also kind of looking at this from my laptop, which is a little bit easier for me to see. But again, you should see right now on the screen in front of you, do you see the slide that says terminology? Okay, very good. So remember, the Quran is both a kitab in a metaphysical sense as well as a physical sense, as I mentioned yesterday, i.e. it is called a kitab before it is actually bound into suhuf, before it's collected into suhuf, the sheafs of parchments or papers, and then before it's actually bound between the two covers of the mushaf. So these are some terms that you'll see. Some are in the Quran. And for example, suhuf is definitely in the Quran. And what's the example of suhuf? Anybody know that? Exactly. So in Surah Al-A'la, إِنَّ هَذَا لَفِي الصُّحُفِ الْأُولَى صُحُفِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ وَمُوسَى. So Allah Ta'ala in chapter 87 refers to the idea of suhuf or scrolls possessed by Sayyidina Ibrahim and Musa alayhim as-salam. So suhuf is in the plural, sahifa is the singular, and then the Quran uses, of course, other terms. Kitab, as we know, recurs quite frequently throughout the Quran. وَهَذَا كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ مُبَارَكٌ فَاتَّبِعُوا وَاتَّقُوا لَعَلَّكُمْ تُرْحَمُونَ. This is Al-An'am 155. This is a book we have revealed. It is blessed. So follow it and have awareness and awe of Allah so that you might receive mercy. Then Allah Ta'ala refers to other terms. Of course, we know terms like Injil and Torah and Zabur. And the Quran itself, by the way, there's debate if the term Quran is a noun that's a proper noun like Torah, Injil, and Zabur, or is it more derived. But what I want to focus on here is terms like Zabur and Alwah. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals about the Zabur, وَرَبُّكَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَلَقَدْ فَضَّلْنَا بَعْضَ النَّبِيِّينَ عَلَى بعض وآتينا داود زبورا. And that's chapter 17. That is An-Nahl verse 55. And we gave Dawood the Zabur. And Zabur, linguistically speaking, is similar to Kitab in the sense that if you look up the verb zabara in the Arabic dictionary, it means to write, record, and scribe. Kataba, of course, means to write. Kitab is the idea of kind of like collating and collecting letters together to write. So the idea of jama' is really kind of present in the term kitab. Also, alwah is a term. So where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the revelation given to Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam as the Torah, Allah Ta'ala mentioned something quite intriguing about the alwah. These are tablets that Sayyidina Musa was given. So we have this ayah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَلَمَّا رَجَعَ مُوسَى إِلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ غَضْبَانَ أَسِفًا قَالَ بِئْسَ مَا خَلَفْتُمُونِي مِنْ بَعْدِي أَعَجِلْتُمْ أَمْرَ رَبِّكُمْ وَأَلْقَى الْأَلْوَاحَ وَأَخَذَ بِرَأْسِ أَخِيهِ يَجُرُّهُ إِلَيْهِ. So we have this very famous episode in chapter 7, Al-A'raf, verse 150. Remember what happens. Musa goes to receive the revelation. He's gone for the 40 nights. Arba'ina layla. He receives the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when he comes back to his people and he sees what they've done, what did they do in his absence? Ya Jama'a, remember? Sisters, what do they do? Masha, I love the sister in the green hijab. I love the enthusiasm. We're going to go here for the moment. Okay, yes. Exactly. Imagine that. So this is, and really, there's so many parables and lessons and experience of Bani Israel. Remember, when we read about Bani Israel, we're not reading about them with the sense of, okay, look what they did in the past, let's condemn them. But there are lessons for our present ummah in the experiences and admonitions given to Bani Israel. So yes, this individual named As-Samiri induces them to worship the golden calf. They rebel against Sayyidina Harun. They threaten his life. He's not able to do anything. So when Musa realizes that, he's angry. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says that he throws the tablets down in his anger, not in any kind of disrespect of the revelation, but he's just so beside himself. And of course, he grabs his brother, by his head or by his beard, kind of pulling him along. And that's when Harun says, قَالَ ابْنَ أُمَّةٍ إِنَّ الْقَوْمَ اسْتَضْعَفُونِي وَكَادُوا يَقْتُلُونَنِي. So this is what Harun says, that the people they overwhelmed me. They were about to set upon me and kill me. So and the tafsir of Al-A'raf is really interesting. At that point, we actually read that when Sayyidina Musa throws down the alwah, the tablets of the Torah, then they're raised to the heavens, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only leaves a fraction of that revelation behind after that incident. So again, these are terms referred to in the Quran. And what's really interesting about the term suhuf, sahifa again. So sahifa is singular, suhuf is plural, and the term mushaf. There is a hadith that probably, I think there might be some weakness in the isnad, but it's still interesting. So there's a narration that at the time that they were gathering together the Quran, that Sayyidina Abu Bakar radiallahu ta'ala anhu was consulting with the companions to decide what do we actually call this book that is coming together, and he was looking at terms that the Jews had, and he did not want to use that terminology. And someone mentioned, well, in Abyssinia, they call what they have a mushaf, let's use that term. Again, I don't know how much support this hadith has, because clearly they don't have to look outside of the tradition. Clearly the Quran itself refers to the idea of suhuf, certainly. So we know now mushaf is when those suhuf, those papers, those sheafs are brought together in a book that is bound, within the covers. And this brings me to the other point that I made, which is that there's also the process of kind of human intervention. Now remember that, of course, the Quran, all of it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the process of human intervention is exactly what we've been studying thus far. Decisions, ijtihad, consultations made by the Sahaba to figure out how best to preserve the Quran, such that by the time you get to Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that's when the mushaf becomes standardized. And the term that you're often going to see in especially a lot of scholarly works, is they will refer to the Uthmani Codex, and that's Codex, and what they mean by that is the mushaf of Sayyidina Uthman. Now Sheikha is here, so I'm very shy to be teaching in front of her, so I would like to run off the stage, but I can't do that. So all right, so inshallah I'll stick around for a few more minutes. So Sheikha, we're just kind of doing a follow-up from yesterday's talk. So So what I want you all to understand is that if we were to be blessed to time travel back to the period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, we would see that the Arabic that they are inscribing in the Quran is an Arabic that we would find it very difficult unless we had training to read that Arabic. So that's my point about human intervention. I want to say a little bit about how the early Qur'ans look. Let's take a look at those. So first things first, remember Sayyidina Uthman advises, he has the committee. Remember, in the committee, he advises the members, let me fast forward this, okay. He advises the members of the committee to do what? He says that if you differ about the wording, any words in the Quran, refer to the dialect of the Quraysh because the Quran was revealed in their dialect, is what he explicitly says. So this is just, in this slide, this just kind of gives you some precursors of the Arabic language. And what's really interesting is that, as you know, of course, Arabic is a Semitic language. And these are some earlier languages like Aramaic and Nabatean. Aramaic is the language of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. And there are theories about Arabic possibly kind of descending from Nabatean. What's really interesting, though, is that the Arabic that is utilized probably in the 5th century CE. So what happens around the year 440 or so, 5th century CE, or this is, of course, way before the birth of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And when was the Prophet born? Which year CE, ya Jama'ah? 570, very good. And Revelation is which year? 610. And he passes away in which year, alayhi salatu wasalam? 632, right? So remember those markers. So, of course, the Am al-Fil is the year of birth. And then after that, we really, once Revelation comes, we kind of refer to the Meccan period in terms of the dating system as really what year of Quran, what year of Ba'atha, what year of Revelation is this? And by the time we get to the Hijrah, we have a new marker of AH. So that's why I will switch to CE dates with some of these ancient dates. So around 440 CE is when someone named Qusay, who was an ancestor of the Prophet, peace be upon him, consolidates the presence of the Quraysh around Mecca. And it probably is around that time when you actually have the emergence of a more recognizable Arabic script. Because prior to that time, you have dialects, you have several Northern Arabian and Southern Arabian dialects. And sometime around the 5th century CE, those dialects begin to converge to where, again, if we were to time travel to that time, the earliest inscriptions are probably rock carvings of lettering that we would identify as Arabic, again, probably around that time, 5th century CE. Some people say slightly earlier, wallahu a'lam. So this is really interesting. So what we have here is a papyrus, and this was located in Heracleopolis in Egypt, and it is the oldest dated Arabic text during the Islamic era. And what's really interesting, again, if you kind of are able to look at this, come close to the image, and you'll actually see that it's bilingual. And what is the other language on this? So this is Egypt, and this is Egypt in the early Islamic era, probably during the Khilafah Rashida, the rightly guided caliphate. What other language do you think would appear on here beside Arabic, history buffs? No. Not hieroglyphics. No. The people using hieroglyphics are long gone. No, we're talking about, remember, Egypt is Greek-speaking. See, so much of the Arabic world does not speak Arabic, ya Jama'ah. It's either the Persianate world or it's in the Byzantine Greek orbit. So I want you all to, Eastern Romans, basically. So I want you all to understand that at this time, if you are Egyptian, you might be Coptic, Christian, and it's a Greek-speaking world. So the document is an example where you have Arabic lettering, and I think it has the Basmala on it. It's actually a contract, and it has Greek and Arabic. And it says, and it's very mundane, by the way, document concerning the delivery of sheep, all right, for down payment of some taxes or something, all right? So it's some kind of business transaction they're documenting. But to me, this is really intriguing because it's also a great example of that coexistence. Remember, Egypt is not going to become Arabized until much later on. All right, but again, what's interesting is that this is an early document going back to, again, probably the era of the rightly guided caliphs with lettering we can actually make out. Let's look at another example. This is an example of the Quran in Hijazi script. And I mentioned Sheikh Yasser Qadi yesterday because he's got some good lectures on YouTube where he talks about the differences amongst the styles of script. And he goes to the Tashkent, the museum in Uzbekistan, to look at the Tashkent manuscript, which we saw yesterday. And, he has some interesting opinions about kind of Kufic versus Hijazi script. Here's Kufic, by the way. It's not easy to read. As you can see, if we were to time travel back to that time, we'd have a really hard time reading the Quran. Now, fortunately for them, they did not need diacriticals, they didn't need dots, because these aids that we're accustomed to having today were just simply not in place at that time. I want you to understand that. So this is what you see right here is Kufic script for on an early Quranic manuscript, and this is Hijazi. This is the Hijazi script, and it is believed that the Masahif of Sayyidina Uthman, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that he sends to the different parts of the Muslim world, were probably in this Hijazi script. It's a beautiful script. It's quite fluid, but again, we don't see much in the way of dots, right? Diacriticals, tashkil, harakat, the clear demarcations of where the ayahs end and where they begin and the surahs end and begin, like none of those things are actually here. Now remember, when you have people that are used to reading Arabic and used to kind of deciphering one letter from another because of memorization, because again, they are so steeped in the orality of the Quran, this is not an issue for them. But it does become an issue later on, again, as more people who are not from Arabia, not from the Hijaz, not native speakers of Arabic become Muslim. So what you see right here, this is an image, this is interesting. This is the one of the dots, right? You all see the red dots? Okay, so the significance of this is that you have scholars that come along, and I'll jump ahead to that slide just so you can see their names. So you have Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, and by the way, this is after Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in the era of Sayyidina Ali, karramallahu wajha. Sayyidina Ali has Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali he has him undertake certain projects in Arabic and Arabic grammar. So here are the dates here. Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali in Basra, which becomes a very important center for the Arabic language. You can see the dates. He died in the year 69 AH, 7th century CE. He's one of the earliest grammarians. And one of the things that's interesting is that there are a couple stories told about this. One of the reasons why he decides to set down the rules of Arabic grammar is because he's hearing people who are non-Arabs, they're making grammatical mistakes. And some say it was his daughter who said, ma ahsanu samai, rather than ma ahsana samaa or something, right? She makes this mistake when she says, how beautiful is the sky, dear father. So he wants to correct her grammar, so they say that's one of the things that might have compelled him to begin working on Arabic grammar. But fortunately for those people who were learning the Quran in that day and age, he comes with these, let me go back to the picture of the red dots. He comes up with an early system of diacriticals, and the way the system works is that he's going to use these red dots to really accomplish a couple things. One, to distinguish one letter from another, because if you think about it, if you take the Arabic alphabet and remove the dots, then you don't really know, are you looking at a noon or a ta or a ya, right? And in other words, the consonantal structure is pretty much the same. It's the kind of addition of the dots that really tell us which letter this is. So he introduces these, and these assist in both knowing one letter from another and also in pronunciation. Now let me ask you this. What do you think? Of course, we can see the advantages of this system and probably a lot of excitement around it. What are the disadvantages, though? Sisters, what do you all think? Again, I'm very nearsighted, so you have to kind of wave at me if you have your hand up. What do you think would become maybe a disadvantage of this early system? Yes? Good. I mean, that's one possibility. The sister said maybe over-reliance on the written text. But the written text is not problematic. Again, all of us rely on the mushaf that we have in front of us. The main issue is that it's cumbersome. It takes up a lot of space on the page. And think about it. In those days, before paper becomes widely available in the Muslim Ummah, they're using papyrus and parchment and vellum, which is like leather, and those things are pretty expensive. So what happens is that you're recycling a lot. You're like wiping away what you write and writing something else, so it becomes very smudged. So that's also an issue. There's an issue, again, it's kind of cumbersome, it takes up space, and the issue of kind of decipherability. So now you're going to have a more sophisticated system, which is going to take hold, and that's the next person that you see here on the slide, and he is Al-Farahidi. So this is a scholar who comes a little bit later on. He's Abu Abdurrahman al-Khalil al-Farahidi, also in Basra. And as you can see, he's basically a century after Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali. And again, we owe a debt of gratitude to these scholars because he introduces the system of the harakat, the diacritical marks, and the fatha and dhamma and kasra and so on in a way that we would recognize today. And how incredibly helpful is that? All right, so these, again, like I said, the role of human intervention here in the preservation of the divine texts, as well as the elaboration of these systems to advance the Arabic language. And again, the revelation of the Quran, dear sisters and dear brothers, it's nothing short of a revolution. I always emphasize this point. The Arabs had, of course, eloquence, and they had fasaha, and they had poetry, and they had a very strong memory and oral culture. But it's the Quran that really becomes the ultimate proof text in Arabic language. The Quran provides the shawahid. The Quran sets the stage. It sets the standard. I mean, the Quran makes it universalizes the Arabic language to where it becomes the language of scholarship, of religion, of theology, of spirituality. And this is with the revelation of the Quran and the sending of the Prophet ﷺ. There's a hand up. Yes. Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, yes, he was. Absolutely. He, in terms of being kind of like a patron of the arts and scholarship, yes, in that sense, very much so. It's a great point. So I really want, and thank you for that question, so I want to emphasize what the revelation of the Quran means, for the Arabic language. A little anecdote I always like to share is that on my father's side, we're Lebanese, but a long time ago. So my dad's great-grandfather came from, was Dawla Uthmaniyya. It was before it was Lebanon and Syria. Bilad al-Sham, under the Ottomans. My great-grandfather, his name was Mansour Hanna Abd al-Masih, came to the United States in the 1890s. And so that means my grandfather and my father were born here. And then my father, when he went to university, he met my mother, who's African-American. She invited him to Islam, and he became Muslim. So, and that's how we got the name Ansari, by the way. He changed his name from Abdul Masih to Ansari. So what's really interesting is that, being from an Arab Christian background, he didn't quite have the connection to the Arabic language the way he wanted to. He knew the sounds and the letters, but being a Muslim, that really inspired him to learn the Arabic language and to learn the Quran. And he was my first Quran teacher, Allah yarhamu. And one of the stories he liked to share is sometimes he would talk to Christian Arabs, and they would kind of whisper to him, "You know what, Brother Mansour?" They would say, "When I want pristine Arabic, I read the Quran, but don't tell anybody." All right? Again, there is no Arabic like the Arabic of the Quran, subhanAllah. Let's go back to some of the images, and then I'll go to Sabat Ahruf, inshallah, for the next part of this. So very, very quickly, you have this beautiful image right here. So another name that I have here is the name of Ibn Bawwab. Ibn Bawwab belonged to the Buyid dynasty, which is interesting, was a Shiite dynasty active during the Abbasid era, and they were, again, patrons of the arts and scholarship. So Ibn Bawwab of the 5th century AH, and he was in Baghdad, he became famous for the type of Quran that you see here in front of you. It's a really beautiful image, especially if you look at it close up, and this is the idea of the Quran being, it's sort of like the illumination, the artwork that they do, where they inscribe the Quran in beautiful calligraphy, they decorate it, and this is much more recognizable to us. Now, in terms of the script or font, you can see it's pretty compressed, but it's very cursive. It has a nice, it's very fluid. It has that cursive aspect to it. You can very clearly see the diacritical marks. You can see the dots. You can see the basmala, the demarcation of the, of the ayahs and the surahs. So Ibn Bawwab, and his name tells you he came from a rather humble background, becomes actually kind of a master calligrapher at this time. And there are still probably in many museums in the Western world, you actually have these Qur'ans that were beautifully inscribed by Ibn Bawwab. And last but not least is kind of what you would recognize as a mushaf today, and that's just an example of, both are the Uthmani codex, but the example, one in the image that you see on the right of the screen is the mushaf you would find in the Arab world that has certain writing conventions, whereas the other mushaf is what you would see in the Urdu or the Persian-speaking world. But again, it's the same mushaf, but there are different conventions. And by the way, there's an entire subject, basically Rasm al-Quran, that you could study that would actually tell you about the conventions and the rules and the styles of writing. It's called Quranic orthography, whose foundations go all the way back to Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Now with that, I want to mention this piece because there were questions about this yesterday. We'll spend a few minutes on this, then inshallah we'll see what questions you have for me. And this is the idea of the sab'at ahruf, and I hinted at it yesterday. And I mentioned that because the Arabs, again, they're so steeped in orality, because the Arabs are not known for having a culture of the written word, that in the very beginning, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, actually makes allowances for something that's called the sab'at ahruf. So let's look quickly to see what do we mean by that. So again, the context is important here. The fact that the Quran is by and large, it's being learned through hearing, through sama', through recitation. In other words, these are kind of auditory methodologies of learning the Quran. Not everybody is going to have a mushaf or a tablet in front of them where they're going to be learning the Quran through that written word. So what that means is that the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, is actually going to say this, and there are many ahadith. I'll give you one of them. So the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he to Jibreel alayhi salam, when he met him, he said, I have been sent to an illiterate, they're ummi, and illiterate people. Amongst them are the old woman, the aged sheikh, and sheikh is not religious scholar, it means elderly man, the servant and the female servant, and the man who has never read a book. Then he said to him, O Muhammad, the Quran has been revealed in 7 ahruf. And by the way, there are so many ahadith like this. Here's another one. Ubay ibn Ka'b reported that the Messenger of God, peace be upon him, was near the watering place of Bani Ghifar when Jibreel came to him and said, Allah has commanded you to recite to your people the Quran in 1 harf. And then the Prophet said, peace be upon him, I ask from Allah pardon and forgiveness. My people are not capable of doing it. So this conversation, much like the reduction of prayers from 50 to 5, this conversation basically continues until Jibreel says, Allah has commanded you to recite the Quran to your people in 7 ahruf, and in whichever they would recite, they would be right. And by the way, these are not obscure ahadith. We find them in Bukhari and Muslim. And there are scholars like I think Abu Ubaid Qasim ibn Salam and others who believe that the level of that these ahadith reach the level of tawatur, of being mass transmitted, because there are so many Sahaba who reported the idea of sab'at ahruf. It's even said that one time Sayyidina Uthman was in the masjid and he said to the Sahaba, stand up if you know about sab'at ahruf, and basically everybody in the masjid stands up. So in other words, large numbers of Sahaba are reporting about this concession of sab'at ahruf. And as you can see, on this, let me fast forward here. As you can see on the slide in front of you, it's necessary because again, the culture is still very much an oral culture. And this is how people are learning the Quran, through auditory learning. So that means that certain variations are going to be allowed in terms of how they recite the Quran. I'm going to come back to this slide, all right, because I want you all to understand the significance of this. First of all, this is really a scholarly discussion, by the way. So in other words, if you're just beginning to study ulum al-Quran, you're probably not really going to study this in much detail. Even the scholars themselves have said it's complicated, it's technical, and there's a lot of debate surrounding it. For example, Suyuti brings about 40 different opinions regarding what the sab'at ahruf actually are. So understand that when you wade into this debate, it's a scholarly debate. And be careful. I mean, there's actually a hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam saying not to argue about the ahruf, because if you start arguing about them, that might lead to kufr. So please understand this important point, that the revelation according to 7 modes or styles, it was not an allowance for people to basically randomly experiment with the Quran. It was a concession, and a fairly temporary one, that allowed an unlettered people to learn the Quran without needing to be able to write it down. So, regarding these different opinions of the scholars, like I said, I'm not going to go through 30, 40 opinions today, but what I will do is I will present an example of what some of the ulama, and this is a modern day scholar, Imam Az-Zarqani, and he has a book on Ulum al-Quran. So Imam Az-Zarqani summarized very helpfully the seven ahruf in terms of what he believes are grammatical differences. Subtle grammatical differences that do not affect the meaning of the Quran. And let's go ahead and look at that slide. All right? So amongst these differences, and these are ayahs, by the way, you can look up the ayahs. So I'll give you all the citations right now. The first example is 23:8. It is Surat Al-Mu'minun, verse 8. The second example you can find in Surat Saba, chapter 34, verse 19. The third example is chapter 85, Surat Al-Buruj, verse 15. So again, 23:8, 34:19, 85:15. Then we have 57:24. I think that's Al-Hadid, right? Al-Hadid, verse 24. Then Surat chapter 50, which is Surat Qaf, I believe, right? Qaf, verse 19. Then Al-Hujurat, 49:6. Then we have 93:1. So these are the examples that I have right here. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. So I'm not going to go through all of them because I need to get to some Q&A, but understand the subtle differences. For example, the reading of from Surah Al-Mu'minun, وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَاتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ versus وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِأَمَانَتِهِمْ وَعَهْدِهِمْ رَاعُونَ. A simple difference of, going back to what Imam Az-Zarqani says, this is a simple difference of what? Of singular versus plural in terms of the noun. Sometimes, Sabat Ahruf, those differences were manifested in terms of the tense of the verb. The tense might be past tense versus an imperative verb. Maybe there were differences in i'rab or case endings, and that's the vowel on the final word or the final letter of the word. Understand that i'rab is a whole science. Ilm al-nahu wal-sarf, these are things that you would study as a student of Arabic grammar. You know that case endings, i.e. the vowel sign on the last letter of the word, it's not arbitrary in the Arabic language, right? Maybe using a pronoun like huwa or not using that pronoun. Or maybe a different word order in the verse, maybe a different word choice, or differences in pronunciation. These are all possible examples of what Sab'at Ahruf might have looked like in the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. All right, so I'm going to wrap this up now so inshallah we can get to some Q&A. I do have a discussion here about Ahruf and Qira'at, but I won't get into Qira'at because you have teachers for that who are much more knowledgeable than me, so they will discuss that. But understand this rule of thumb, dear brothers and dear sisters, Sab'at Ahruf are not equivalent to the Qira'at, not at all. Don't make that alignment, they're not equivalent. All right, people make, again, sort of this, they have this idea that they must kind of match up evenly. No, they don't. Sab'at Ahruf, this was an early system or concession allowed to a community that was largely unlettered, so to help them to memorize the Quran and to accommodate for differences of dialect amongst the Arabs. That's what it was. Then Sayyidina Uthman preserved probably a portion of the Sab'at Ahruf in his Mus'haf, and then what he preserved became the foundation for the 7 to 10 canonical readings or qira'at that Hufadh are trained on today. Don't let anybody confuse you about this matter, because sadly, if you go online, especially for the young people, there are a lot of Islamophobes who love to attack the integrity of the Quran and the character of the Prophet, peace be upon him, because of their complete sort of distortions of these technical scholarly subjects. You know, do yourself a favor, don't listen to fools, go to the ulama, go to people who truly love Allah Ta'ala and His Messenger, please. All right? Last but not least is this hadith, and then we'll take some questions and answers. So very quickly, let's look at this hadith. It's a famous hadith. And Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu said that he went into the masjid, he heard Hisham ibn Hakim reciting from Surah Al-Furqan. This is during the lifetime of God's Messenger, peace be upon him. And he was so upset, he almost jumped on Hisham as Hisham ibn Hakim was praying. He restrained himself, but as soon as Hisham was done, Umar dragged him to the Prophet, peace be upon him. We can see that happening. And subhanallah. And they go to the Prophet, And because he's upset, because Hisham says, this is how the Prophet taught me. So the Prophet basically does what? He has both men recite Al-Furqan, and the Prophet says that it was revealed that way. Okay? Release him, O Umar. He has Hisham recite, then he recited in the same ways he'd heard him reciting. Allah's Messenger said, alayhi salatu wasalam, it was revealed in this way. He affirms for both men the existence of these different ahruf, but the key here is that they learned this, not randomly, not arbitrarily, they learned this from the Prophet himself, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So I hope this addendum was helpful, and now we have a few minutes for some Q&A. All right. Jazakallah khairan. Okay, so several hands are going up. I'm going to start with the ladies, and then inshallah, then we'll go to the brothers. I see the sister in the pink scarf. Wa alaikum salam.
I had a question about what they call the Uthmanic manuscript. Because in Umm Quran, some people say that what is known as the Uthmanic manuscript can be what they call false attributions. And I wanted to know why. Is it because only what the Mus'haf that were based on the Uthman Codex, this is what we preserve, and the other ones were supposed to be burned, or is it that it's just a misconception?
That's a great question. So I'm going to just quickly restate the question. So the question is about using the term Uthmani Codex. Is that your question? You mentioned also kind of false ascriptions. And then you mentioned the idea of Sayyidina Uthman having destroyed those manuscripts that were at variance with his, correct? Okay, so very quickly, what I can say about this is that, because I'm not sure about the idea of false ascriptions, I'd have to have a little bit more context for this, but what I want you all to understand is that anybody that questions the methodology of Sayyidina Uthman to suggest that somehow there are Qur'ans that are more authoritative than what he produced, those people are wrong. So I want to emphasize that point, that the reason why Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu standardizes the Mus'haf and then has those other copies that don't conform to his destroyed is precisely to preserve the integrity of the text. Having said that, though, there are private collections amongst Sahaba like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b that are said to have some variations from Uthman's Mus'haf, if that's the question. However, upon closer examination, when you look at their Masahif, you're going to notice a couple of things. One, like any of us, when we write our notes, we mix a lot of things together, and that's what they did. All right, they have Quran, they have ahadith, they have dua. Two, when you look at more closely, say for example, at the Mus'haf of Ubay ibn Ka'b, you see very clearly that he has written down dua al-qunut and other supplications along with the Quran. So the untrained person looks at that and they say, oh, Ubay has a Mus'haf that's different from Uthman's. So we need to make sure not to make those mistakes. I hope that's helpful. Sister in the green scarf. Wa alaikum salam.
I had a question, like, how did they split the Quran into ajza?
How do they split the Quran into ajza? That is a great question. Honestly, I don't remember off the top of my head. So given that there are so many teachers in this room who are much more knowledgeable than me, I'm trying to recall what I reviewed about the ajza. I feel like it's something that happens later on, maybe during Sayyidina Umar's era, but I'm not confident to answer that one, so I will say I'll pass on that question. But inshallah, if you come to me afterwards, I can get back to you. Yes.
My question revolves around what you talked about yesterday, if that's okay. So from the time of Abu Bakar leaving the Khilafah up until it's been slightly over 100 Hijri years since the fall of the Ottoman Khilafah, and obviously the Sahaba, they were like the best of the best, and then through time it just kind of but I feel like talking about the Khilafah in a sense that it was, when it fell, it was so heartbreaking for all Muslims, not just the Muslims of the Ottoman regions, because Muslims lost their sense of protection. And essentially my question is that do you see, as a sheikh, do you see signs of revival, or is it good for us Muslims to have an optimistic hope for a Khilafah, or is it just like a far reach for us?
What a beautiful and very, I think, very important philosophically. And by the way, there's only one sheikh and the sheikh Haifa, so yeah, I'm going to make that point very clear. The khilafah, so our dear sisters asked a question about restoration of khilafah and what should be our perspective regarding that. Several hands went up on the brother's side, so very quickly, my dear sister, I will say this, that the Prophet, peace upon him, and several ahadith actually predicted what unfolded in Islamic history. And he said that after the era of Nabuwah, that Allah would will this era to exist, and Allah would lift it. Then after that, 30 years of rightly guided caliphate. Then after that, there would be an era of what he calls mulkan adda, sort of a biting kingship. Then he says there's an era of tyrannical rule. Then he says there's going to be an era of justice, governance based upon his sunnah, alayhi salam, once again. So this is actually part of Sunni theology to actually confirm this and to say yet that there is going to be an era of justice, and that will be embodied, in the person called the Mahdi that will come, the return of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam to confront the Antichrist. This is all part of Sunni theology. Now, of course, I can't get into the Ottomans, but what I can say very quickly is that when you look at the circumstances around the fall of the Ottoman Empire, it's very clear to me that much of what happens around World War I and its causes directly relate to the fact that the Ottoman Empire, as weak as it was during that time, it still poses a significant block of resistance to the designs of the enemies of Islam. And they have to understand, in order to really be able to go in and colonize the Muslim world and usurp those resources, you have to destroy the caliphate. And by the way, one of the ways that this happens is they destroy it from within with Turkish nationalism. Because the Turks themselves are the ones that actually vote to abolish the caliphate and replace it with a republic, with Ataturk at the head of that. All right, and by the way, the Muslims never got over the trauma of the destruction of the caliphate. We never got over that. It induced a great deal of spiritual and psychological trauma. Okay, for the brothers now, inshallah, if I have a few more minutes to get to some of the brothers' questions. The brother's been very patient. We'll start with the brother there in the back. I mean, Jazakallah khair. That means a lot to me. To walk into a room and find someone that knows my dad, please make dua for him. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khairah. Allah yarhamu. I'm very grateful to you, brother. Thank you for your dua. Yes, and we'll just kind of come to the middle of the room. Yes, and I'm nearsighted, so please, if you wave at me, brother, there's a brother there in the middle. Yes. Yes, probably around, I would say, going back to those dates that I gave you in terms of the tashkil. Let's go ahead and look at that slide to see those dates. Within the 1st century AH, certainly. That's what I would say. Because remember, Abu al-Aswad al-Du'ali, who brings the dots, is during this Sayyidina Ali's Khilafah, and then after him al-Farahidi. So definitely within the 1st century AH. Very good question. Next, was there anyone else in the middle? Okay, then I'll come to the front row. Yes. That's a great question. So remember, the sab'at ahruf, in terms of 7 modes or styles, they are coterminous with the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. In other words, the Prophet himself, alayhi salam, is literally petitioning Gabriel to allow my ummah to recite in up to sab'at ahruf. Now, it doesn't mean that every ayah or every surah is recited 7 ways, by the way, but it allows for some variation. Now, when Sayyidina Uthman standardizes the Mus'haf, the Prophet has passed away, peace be upon him, so he can't ask the Prophet. So there are opinions, and Sheikh Yasir Qadhi's chapter, and this is really great, he basically says 3 things, I think. There are 3 views. One is that Sayyidina Uthman does not use a sab'at ahruf at all. He doesn't preserve any of them. The other opinion is that he preserves all of them. And I think the opinion that I believe is probably the most sound is that he preserves some of what is applicable from the sab'at ahruf in the Mus'haf today, which, by the way, if you have a hafidh trained on the qira'at, he or she can open up the one Mus'haf and recite in multiple styles. So in a sense, the qira'at are descendants of the ahruf, but it's not an exact match, if that makes sense. Okay? Wa iyakum. A lot of hands going up, mashallah. The brother in the middle there. Yeah, so yes, is Sheikh Abdul Wahab here? Okay, Sheikh Abdul, I know I've gone over my time. Do you have a session on abrogation? Because if so, I would prefer. Okay, so for our dear brother here, if you go to that session, that would be a great way to get that question answered. All right, yes.
It's kind of a two sort of question. So you mentioned how the qira'at are kind of like a sort of descendant of the ahruf. The first kind of question is, who are the imams, or were they students of the Sahaba directly, or do we know who they were exactly, and their relationship with the Sahaba? And the second one was related to maqamat, and I've heard, how do they relate to the qira'at?
So this is where I'm going to defer to, because I know there, Sheikh Abdul Wahab, I know there are scholars who are teaching on the qira'at, and this is their area of expertise. So for the maqamat, I would say please ask them that question. For the qira'at, I will very quickly say, when the Sahaba move to different cities and they take students, schools of qira'ah are actually established really by the tabi'een and tabi'een who are directly taking from the Sahaba. So you can rest assured, any qira'ah that is a valid qira'ah supported by asanid goes all the way back to those tabi'een and the companions. Absolutely they do. But inshallah, the teachers who teach that will get into that. But their entire asanid and turuq and pathways that tell us exactly what is the provenance of those qira'at. There was a brother in that part of the... Yes. Sheikh, do I need to stop? Am I going over someone's time? One more is good? Okay, so inshallah, if there are pressing questions, again, I will be around for a few more hours, inshallah. I also have my business cards if you want to email me, so I can take one more question. So the brother here.
So I guess if somebody was struggling with understanding the different points of the Quran as it came together, with one high-level proof that the Quran is what it is today because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise that He was going to protect it. So essentially meaning if you have, unsure aspect of the Quran and how it was compiled, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He was going to protect it, meaning that you should have no question of its current state and misuse that. Is that a good summary?
I think that's an excellent summary. And I will say this, in terms if you're looking for a mic drop moment, let me say this. If you go back and you look at the earliest classical texts that have reproduced the Quran from the earliest time, you compare that to the folios and the parchments that they are actually dating back to the era of Sayyidina Uthman, and you look at what we have today, you will find that everything is an exact match. I'm confident to make that argument. And also understand, my dear brother, anybody who is questioning the integrity of the Quranic text, I truly do not to say you are, but people kind of outside the community, I truly do not understand where they are coming from, given the fact that Christian and Jewish scholars themselves will acknowledge that what the books that they have with them today have undergone so many changes and edits and deletions and omissions and arguments about what's actually in the canon and what's not in the canon. So for people that come to Muslims to make complaints about the Quran, I personally find those complaints very disingenuous. I remember going to a Bible college. These are Bible-believing Christians who actually said they were kind of really impressed with how Muslims viewed the Quran, and they said for them the Bible was just kind of a compilation of different things from here and there. I was shocked to actually hear them say that, and that's what they said. So again, rest assured of what Allah Ta'ala promised, that what we recite today, if we could go back to any period of Islamic history, we would find no variation. Now, there might be different pronunciations, different recitation styles, but that Quran is the same Quran, rest assured. Jazakumullah khairah. So please forgive me for going over, and thank you, Sheikh, for inviting me back. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه والحمد لله رب العالمين.